If you hear someone groan about a Sisyphean task,
Yeah.
you instantly know what they mean, right? Utter, pointless, just soul-crushing effort.
Absolutely. It's the classic image, Sisyphus, the man, eternally condemned to roll this immense boulder up a hill in the underworld.
Only to watch it inevitably roll away again.
Yeah.
Just awful.
He is, well, arguably the most famous failure in all of mythology. But focusing only on the punishment, it really does a massive disservice to the man himself.
Right.
He didn't just end up on that hill by accident. There's a whole story there.
And that's the central question we're really launching our deep dive into today. Why was Sisyphus truly punished? And, how did this legendary king of Corinth earn the reputation as the single craftiest, most cunning man in all of Greek mythology?
Because that fate, that specific punishment, it wasn't for just any common criminal. It was like custom tailored.
Tailored for someone who genuinely believed his own intelligence could outmaneuver fate itself.
Yeah.
And even the Olympian gods.
Exactly. So our mission here is to take a really hard look at the sources, the Homeric epics, the later Greek tragedies, the Roman reinterpretations, and crucially, the modern philosophers, too.
To get past just the Rolling Stone image.
Right. We need to dissect the full scope of Sisyphus's character, his truly audacious crimes, and why his specific struggle still defines so much today. From how we view ambition to, well, the modern psychological state of meaningless labor.
Okay, let's unpack that reputation right from the start then. Sisyphus. He was the founder and first king of Ephyra.
Which we now know as Corinth, a major city.
A major city, yes. And the punishment, we all know it, rolling that immense boulder up a steep gradient in Tartarus, a cycle of completion just forever snatched away.
It's the ultimate cosmic treadmill, as you said, total utility.
But even before he committed his first documented act of treachery, the essence of Sisyphus seems kind of written into his name, or at least how later scholars saw it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. When you look at the suggested origins of the name Sisyphus, you find this immediate ambiguity, but it often circles back to his defining characteristic, his cleverness, his cunning.
What are the main academic arguments there? What do they suggest?
Well, the name itself is likely pre-Greek. That suggests he's a really ancient figure, maybe predating even the written myths we have access to.
Older than Homer, even.
Potentially, yeah. But the linguist R.S.P. Beeks, he suggested a connection with the root of the word sophos.
Sophos meaning wise or cunning.
Exactly. So if that connection holds, his name inherently linked him to acute intelligence, strategic knowledge. He was quite literally the wise guy of his era, smart, but maybe dangerously so.
Which makes perfect sense for a trickster figure, doesn't it? It almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If your name means wise, maybe you lean into it.
It certainly seems to fit, though, we should also mention the less common theories, just for completeness.
Like what?
Like the one proposed by the German mythographer Otto Group. He linked the name Sisyphus to Sisyphus.
Sisyphus. What does that mean?
It means a goat's skin, possibly related to some kind of old rain charm or an agrarian ritual.
Huh. Okay, that's different. Shifts the focus completely.
It does. It moves from intellectual cunning to something more tonic, maybe a localized power over nature, something earthy.
But the main takeaway remained his intelligence.
Pretty much, yeah. Regardless of the etymological ambiguity, the Greek world ultimately settled on the definition that mattered most. Sisyphus was defined by his Sophia, his acute manipulative wisdom. So right away, he's introduced as this figure of highly specific and, well, dangerous cunning.
So whether he was named for wisdom or a goat hide, he definitely ended up acting like the smartest, perhaps slipperiest man in the room.
And to truly appreciate the sheer audacity of his crimes, the ones against the Olympians, we really have to first firmly establish his position, his reputation within the mythological world.
Okay.
Homer, the poet whose work pretty much defined Greek culture for centuries, he famously describes Sisyphus in both the Iliad and the Odyssey as Kerdistos in Ron.
Which translates to?
The craftiest of men, or sometimes most cunning or most gainful. He was the gold standard for intellectual manipulation, for getting ahead through wits.
And he didn't just spring from nowhere, right? He came from a pretty important family, if maybe a bit dysfunctional.
Extremely dysfunctional is probably fair. Yeah, he was the son of King Aeolus of Aeolia and Enerete, and he was part of this huge, sprawling family that included loads of other significant mythological figures, like his brothers Athamas and Salmoneus.
We'll definitely get back to Salmoneus.
Oh, absolutely. And Sisyphus married the Pleiad Merope, one of the seven sisters you see in the sky.
Right, the star cluster.
Exactly. And her star, Merope's star, is famously the dimmest in the Pleiades constellation. Some later stories suggested maybe this reflected her shame, at marrying a mortal figure who committed such wickedness.
Interesting touch. And they had children.
They did. Through Merope, Sisyphus fathered Ornatian, Glaucus, Thersander, and Ulmus, so he establishes a lineage.
The family tree alone gives him serious mythological weight. I mean, Glaucus, his son, wasn't he the father of Bellerophon?
That's the one. Bellerophon, the hero who rode Pegasus and slew the Chimera.
Wow. So Sisyphus is the grandfather of a major Greek hero.
Exactly. He's the progenitor of major heroes. But here's the nugget, the detail that really stands out if you're digging into this material properly.
Okay.
Several ancient sources, including the historian Istrus, actually claim that Sisyphus, not Laertes, was the true father of Odysseus.
Wait, hold on. Odysseus. The Odysseus.
Huh.
The ultimate hero of cunning and strategy. The guy who invented the Trojan horse.
That Odysseus. The claim is that Sisyphus seduced Odysseus' mother, Anticlea, before her marriage to Laertes, or perhaps even during it.
Okay, stop there. If Sisyphus is the true father of Odysseus, the man known for Metis, for cunning intelligence, for strategic delay, what does that imply about the whole legacy of intelligence in the Greek heroic age?
It implies, that the bloodline of Metis, that specific Greek concept combining cunning, practical wisdom, and skill, it runs directly from Sisyphus straight through Odysseus.
So it's not just two famous tricksters who happen to be clever, it's a direct lineage.
Potentially. It could be an attempt by later mythographers to create a single source, a fountainhead, for that kind of strategic brilliance. It establishes this line defined by intellectual superiority and, crucially, by the ability to find loopholes in fate, which is exactly what Sisyphus specialized in.
So Sisyphus is maybe the original godfather of strategic thinking in Greek myth.
Wow. But okay, before these epic connections, he had to secure his own legacy first, as king.
Which he did. He founded Ephyra, which was later renamed Corinth, and by most accounts he was a highly effective king, if morally flexible.
Right. The sources credit him with significant public works.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Including establishing the Isthmian Games.
That's a big deal. Those were one of the 4 great Panhellenic Games, right? Alongside the Olympics. A huge civic achievement. A massive achievement. Pausanias, the geographer, he tells us Sisyphus established the games in honor of Melicertes, this boy whose body washed ashore near Corinth.
Melicertes. Wasn't he related to Ino and Athamas? Part of another tragic family story?
Yes, exactly. His mother Ino leaped into the sea with him. Sisyphus found the body, ensured it was given proper funeral rites, and instituted the games, which, paradoxically, suggests he was concerned with ritual propriety.
A concern he would later weaponize against the gods themselves.
Precisely. Alternatively, the poet Pindar suggested the games were founded under the guidance of some local nymphs. Either way, Sisyphus was a king of action, building his city's prestige.
But his true character is ruthlessness. It really comes out not in founding games, but in that conflict with his own brother, Salmoneus. Can you detail that treachery for us? It sounds nasty.
Oh, it's profoundly nasty. The hatred between Sisyphus and Salmoneus was legendary. Salmoneus himself was ruling in Elis and was, frankly, pretty hubristic himself. He used to pretend to be Zeus, dragging bronze cauldrons behind his chariot to imitate thunder.
Okay, so arrogance ran in the family.
It seems so. But Sisyphus's hatred took him down a path of cold, calculated murder plotting. He actually went to the Oracle of Delphi.
To ask for permission.
Not permission, to ask for guidance. Not on if he should kill his brother, but specifically how to do it without suffering severe, direct consequences. He was looking for a clean kill, consequence-free, always gaming the system.
Always anticipating the divine retribution, looking for the loophole.
Always. The oracle's advice was, as usual, pretty obscure, but Sisyphus interpreted it as requiring him to use Salmoneus' own daughter, Tyro.
Use her how?
His complex and frankly chilling plot was to seduce Tyro, have children with her, and then somehow use those children as agents to eventually overthrow and kill their grandfather, Salmoneus.
Whoa. Murder by proxy. Using his own kids, his nephews and nieces to kill his brother.
Exactly. It was murder planned across a generation, utilizing familial ties to eliminate an old rival. Astonishingly ruthless. He weaponized family love, his own progeny.
Did it work?
Thankfully, no. Tyro discovered the plot before it could be fully realized. And in this horrifying choice, driven by desperation, needing to protect her father, she actually slew her own children, the ones she had by Sisyphus.
Oh my God. That's horrific.
It is. But this narrative right there at the start of Sisyphus's known story, it perfectly illustrates his absolute willingness to sacrifice anyone, his lover, his children, his brother, for strategic political gain. This foundational ruthlessness really sets the stage for his later, much bigger confrontations, the ones with the deities themselves.
Okay, so that sibling rivalry gives us real insight into Sisyphus's lack of morality. But the next set of actions, these define his hubris. We're moving now into the territory of him betraying Zeus directly and then defeating the concept of death itself.
Right. These are the acts that were so disruptive, so fundamentally challenging to the cosmic order, that they demanded an eternal, uniquely designed punishment.
This is the moment Sisyphus really crosses the line, isn't it? He stops being just a tricky local king.
And starts challenging the fundamental power structure of the cosmos. Yeah, he steps onto the biggest stage possible.
So his first major divine betrayal, revealing the whereabouts of the nymph Aegina. She'd been abducted by Zeus. What was Sisyphus's motivation for crossing the king of the gods like that? That seems unwise.
Unwise is an understatement. Aegina's father was the river god, Sisyphus. He was desperately searching everywhere for his missing daughter. Sisyphus knew Zeus had hidden her.
And he saw an opportunity.
A huge opportunity. He used this divine secret as critical leverage. But crucially, Sisyphus didn't betray Zeus out of, moral principle or loyalty to Sisyphus. He did it for a completely practical, almost mundane, yet vital exchange.
Which was?
Sisyphus had to cause a permanent, reliable spring of fresh water to flow on the Acropolis of Corinth, the Acrocorinth.
Wait, he traded the secret location of Zeus's kidnapped lover for city plumbing.
Pretty much. The betrayal of the ruler of the entire universe was bartered for municipal infrastructure. It's astonishingly pragmatic when you think about it.
What does that mindset tell us? Sacrificing divine obedience for something as basic as a reliable water source. Does it suggest he saw himself more as, a responsible king just prioritizing his city? Or was it pure arrogance?
It certainly suggests his priorities were entirely earthbound and utilitarian. He viewed divine secrets, godly power, everything, as commodities. Things to be traded for, tangible, beneficial results for his kingdom, his people.
He was willing to risk eternal damnation for better public works.
That seems to be the calculation. Zeus, of course, was absolutely furious at this blatant prioritization of earthly gain over divine authority, over keeping divine secrets.
So Zeus ordered immediate retribution, right? He sent someone.
He did. He sent Thanatos, the actual personification of death, to chain Sisyphus up and drag him straight down to Tartarus. No trial, just immediate removal.
But Sisyphus was ready for him.
Oh, he was ready. He was the master strategist, remember, the man of Medius. He somehow anticipated death's arrival. And when Thanatos entered, Sisyphus managed to engage him in conversation.
What did he say?
Maybe he marveled at the strength of the chains or the design. The sources are a bit vague, but the point is, he cleverly convinced Thanatos to demonstrate how the chains actually worked. Show me how these fit.
The oldest trick in the book. He lured the personification of death into demonstrating his own shackles.
Unbelievably, yes. And in doing so, Sisyphus trapped Thanatos himself. He actually chained death and then hid him away somewhere.
The audacity. Just chaining death. What did that do to the world?
The consequence must have been absolute cosmic disruption. Chaos.
What kind of chaos? What were the specific effects on Earth?
Well, the sources describe a world plunged into this bizarre, inverted state. Since death was bound, literally no one could die.
No one. Anywhere.
No one. Soldiers wounded in battle would just bleed and suffer but never succumb. The old, the desperately sick, they lingered endlessly, unable to find release from their suffering.
That sounds horrific.
Yeah.
Not peaceful at all.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And it had other consequences, too. Sacrifices to the gods were disrupted because, the sacrificial animals couldn't actually die to complete the ritual. The whole cosmic machine, the divine economy of life and death, it just ground to a painful halt.
And who was the god most annoyed by this cessation of mortality?
Ironically, it was Ares, the god of war.
Why Ares?
Well, Ares derives his satisfaction, his power, his whole purpose from the carnage and the finality of battle. If no one can actually die, war loses its ultimate sting. It just becomes this repetitive, pointless struggle.
A truly Sisyphean activity, ironically enough.
Exactly. So Ares may be annoyed that his battles were less diverting, or perhaps because the whole system was breaking down, he intervened personally. He freed Thanatos, restored the natural function of death, and finally turned Sisyphus over to him to be dragged off to the underworld as originally intended.
Now, you mentioned there was an alternative version. about who got chained.
Yes, that's right. In some perhaps more dramatic versions of the story, it wasn't Thanatos, the personification, who was chained. It was Hades himself, the actual ruler of the underworld.
Chaining a major Olympian god. That raises the stakes considerably.
Immensely. In that version, the gods couldn't just send Ares. They had to threaten Sisyphus, not with immediate punishment, but with something maybe worse for him. An endless, miserable earthly life. A slow, painful decline that would make him wish he were dead if he didn't release the captured god.
So they used his own desire for life against him.
Exactly. The cunning man was forced to comply by the promise of protracted suffering on Earth.
Okay, so either way, he's forcibly taken away this time. He's been beaten by Ares or pressured by the gods. Thanatos finally has him. That really should be the end of the story.
You'd think so.
But Sisyphus still has one more trick up his sleeve. Cheating death, part 2. He actually prepared for his own physical demise.
He absolutely did. This is maybe Sisyphus's ultimate strategic maneuver, because this time he manipulates the deepest societal and ritual laws of the Greeks.
How? What did he do?
Before his eventual actual death, whenever that happened, Sisyphus instructed his wife, Merope, to do something shocking. He told her not to bury him, not to perform any funeral rites, no coin for Charon the ferryman, just toss his naked corpse into the public square.
Why would he ask for that? He framed it as a test.
He might have framed it as a test of her love, yeah. Do this unconventional thing to prove you trust me, but it was purely tactical, purely strategic.
What were the ritual implications of just leaving a body unburied in the square?
For the ancient Greeks, it was a catastrophic violation of piety, of sacred duty, of everything. A proper burial was absolutely essential for the soul, the psyche, to pass peacefully into the realm of Hades. Without the proper rites, the soul was believed to be condemned to wander the banks of the river Styx eternally. Restless. Lost.
Okay, so Sisyphus arrives in the underworld, presumably without the proper credentials because he wasn't buried right. Then what?
Then he marches right up to Hades, or maybe Persephone, the queen of the underworld, and presents himself not as a guilty soul finally caught, but as a victim of gross neglect.
He plays the victim card, claiming his wife's disrespect justified a temporary return.
Exactly that. He complained bitterly, probably playing on Persephone's known sense of justice or propriety. He argued that the disrespect shown by his wife, the complete lack of burial rites, was such a profound injustice, such an offense against tradition, that it basically negated the very reason he was stuck in the underworld. He needed to go back.
He needed to return to the world of the living just to scold Merope and make sure his body received the proper rituals necessary for, safe passage back to the underworld later.
That was the argument. And unbelievably, the rulers of the dead fell for it. They bought his legalistic, ritualistic manipulation.
They granted him a temporary leave, a return ticket.
A monumental strategic error on their part, because once Sisyphus was back on Earth, back in Corinth,
He just didn't go back.
he immediately rejected the terms of his return. He simply resumed his life, ruling his kingdom, probably laughing about his clever victory over the divine bureaucracy, enjoying the sunshine.
For how long?
Until he died of advanced old age many, many years later. Some sources suggest he was only finally dragged back down to Tartarus, forcibly this time, years later by Hermes, the messenger god, acting as a divine enforcer to make sure the cosmic balance was finally restored for good.
Wow. He beat the divine judiciary at its own game. Not once, but twice. It truly explains why the eventual punishment had to be so specific, so utterly tailored to negate his defining characteristic, that hope, that confidence, driven by his relentless cunning.
Which brings us finally to that famous image, the rock. Sisyphus's final internal fate. It was delivered to him, we need to stress, not merely because he maybe murdered his brother or betrayed Zeus for a water spring. It was because of his fundamental hubris.
His belief that his own superior intellect could consistently outwit the gods themselves. Zeus, Hades, the whole system.
That core belief, that arrogance, the gods finally having him pinned down for good. They had to devise a torture that specifically neutralized his defining quality, his ability to strategize, anticipate outcomes, and find a way out.
So the labor itself, the rolling of the rock, had to be designed to break that spirit.
Exactly. That's why the labor had to be infinitely repetitive and perpetually frustrating. The real psychological genius of Hades' final sentence wasn't just the hard work, it was enchanting the boulder itself.
Enchanting it how?
the stone was magically weighted or maybe just inherently slippery, or the hill was designed so that just as Sisyphus neared the summit, that precise moment where he could anticipate success, feel that flicker of hope, it would inevitably roll away from him, back down to the bottom. Every single time.
Yeah.
Consigning him to an eternity of useless efforts and, crucially, unending anticipated frustration.
So the real torture isn't the muscle strain, it's the psychological warfare. It's the perpetual promise of completion being snatched away at the very last second.
Precisely. It's the constant cycle of hope followed immediately by failure, which, when you think about it, perfectly mirrors Sisyphus's own habit of manipulating hope and trust in his victims, doesn't it?
Poetic justice, in a way. A truly cruel way.
And that is the mechanism, that specific form of torture that gave us the term Sisyphean.
Right. Denoting any activity that feels pointless, cyclical, maybe interminable, without any real possibility of permanent success. It perfectly captures that existential despair of repetitive, meaningless labor.
It's become a universal shorthand for futility.
It's fascinating, though, how quickly ancient thinkers tried to, well, rationalize this image, to move it out of the realm of just pure moral punishment and connect it to something concrete, something natural.
They absolutely did. It's a very strange image, after all. One of the earliest attempts was what scholars call the solar theory.
Solar, like the sun.
Exactly. Some ancient scholars suggested Sisyphus wasn't actually a man at all, but a personification of the sun's disk.
How does that work?
The sun rises daily in the east. That's the struggle upwards, rolling the fiery disk up the hill of the sky. And then, inevitably, it sinks back down into the west, into darkness, rolling back down again.
Okay. So the myth becomes an explanation for the relentless, predictable cycle of day and night. A natural metaphor.
A wonderful piece of natural metaphor, yeah. It links his eternal struggle to the greatest source of cosmic repetition we experience.
Were there other natural interpretations?
Yes. Similarly, other scholars saw him as a personification of the unpredictable sea. You know, the constant rising and falling of waves, the perpetual movement of the tides, or maybe the treacherous nature of currents that endlessly roll and crash against the shore.
Again, that ceaseless up and down motion. It fits the image.
It does. The eternal climb and fall reflected in nature.
And then there was a more grounded, practical reading, relating him somehow to the building of his own city, Corinth.
Yes, exactly. Figures like Friedrich Welcker and later Salomon Reinach, they suggested Sisyphus symbolizes the intense labor and the sheer backbreaking skill involved in major ancient building projects.
Like building the walls or temples of Corinth.
Precisely. Reinach even argued the punishment might have been directly inspired by a visual representation, maybe a painting or relief, of Sisyphus literally rolling a massive stone up the steep slope of the Acrocorinthus, the Acropolis overlooking Corinth, symbolic of the immense difficulty and physical toll required for civil engineering in the ancient world.
Turning his punishment into a symbol of his achievement, almost.
Or at least the cost of that achievement.
Yeah.
But perhaps the most enduring ancient interpretation, the one that really provides a strong bridge to modern philosophy, is the political reading.
Political? Who offered that?
The Roman Epicurean philosopher Lucretius, back in the 1st century BC. He wrote about it in his great poem, De Rerum Naturo.
And how did Lucretius see Sisyphus?
Lucretius gave Sisyphus a highly cynical but very relevant contemporary meaning for his time. He saw the myth as personifying the political class, particularly in the Roman Republic.
So Sisyphus represents politicians.
Ambitious men, yeah. Politicians who endlessly aspire to high political office, seeking power, seeking the consulship or other honors, only to be constantly frustrated, defeated by rivals, or maybe overthrown by the fickle mob, the voters.
The struggle up the hill is the political campaign.
Exactly. And just when they think they've reached the top, secured the office, something happens. An election loss, a political scandal, shifting alliances, and the rock rolls back down. They have to start all over again.
What specifically did Lucretius say about the object of their desire, the power itself?
He argued that this constant quest for political power and status was ultimately an empty thing, a relentless, self-imposed struggle that yielded no lasting satisfaction, no real result beyond the struggle itself.
The metaphor was perfect then. The politician struggles to push their agenda, or just gain power, up the hill. But at the moment of perceived triumph, the mechanisms of power, or the demands of the people, just pull them right back down.
Consigning them to renewed, equally frustrating effort, Lucretius saw it as speaking directly to the vanity inherent in ambition, especially ambition without genuine public good at its heart.
Wow, that reframing is profound. It turns divine punishment into a mirror for human, self-imposed, power-driven misery. That really shifts the perspective. Okay, so Lucretius definitely sets the stage for the modern philosophical engagement with Sisyphus. He stops being just a character in a myth.
And becomes this potent symbol, a symbol for the struggle that defines the human condition itself.
Right, and we find him popping up everywhere, from classical texts carrying forward right into, well, 20th century anxiety and philosophy.
He really becomes the focal point for discussing big themes. Resilience, meaning futility, rebellion.
We mentioned Homer already and Ovid briefly, but let's dive a bit deeper into Plato's use of him. You mentioned Socrates in the Apology.
Yes. Socrates, while contemplating his own potential death sentence, muses about what he hopes to do in the afterlife. He actually expresses anticipation, excitement almost, about meeting figures down there, judges like Minos and Rhadamanthus, but also figures known for being wise, or at least thinking they were wise.
And Sisyphus is on that list.
Sisyphus is right there on the list. Socrates basically says he looks forward to questioning Sisyphus, to interrogating him, to determine who truly possesses wisdom, that word, sophos again, and who only thinks he is wise when he is not.
So the greatest mythological questioner wants to interrogate the greatest mythological trickster about the very nature of his famous cunning. That's brilliant.
It's an intellectual showdown for the ages, isn't it? It connects right back to the potential etymology of Sisyphus's name, fundamentally challenging his identity even in the afterlife.
But let's swing back to Ovid for a second. His metamorphoses and that specific moment of stillness you mentioned. Why is that scene considered so powerful?
Right, in the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus goes down to the underworld to retrieve his wife, and his music, his song fueled by grief and love, is so incredibly potent, so beautiful, that it literally forces the laws of the underworld to pause. Everything stops.
And Ovid makes a point of showing this.
He does. He highlights the effect on the perpetually tormented souls. He says the Furies, the goddesses of vengeance, actually weep. And then the text specifically tells us Sisyphus stops his eternal task. He sets the boulder down, and he sits on his rock.
Incutor sedisti Sisyphus exo. And you sat, Sisyphus, on your rock. That image is just beautiful, because for that one brief moment, human passion, art, love, grief, it proves stronger than eternal cosmic punishment.
Exactly. The cycle of futility is broken. Not by divine intervention, not by trickery, but by mortal grief expressed through beauty.
That momentary reprieve, it grants Sisyphus this fragile humanity back, doesn't it? The very thing his punishment was designed to strip away.
It really does. It shows he's still capable of being moved, of responding to something beyond his own endless, self-absorbed struggle. Now, moving forward quite a bit into the 20th century, figures like Franz Kafka, they saw Sisyphus embodying their own deep-seated anxieties.
Kafka, how so?
Well, commentators like Frederick Carl point out how Kafka describes Sisyphus, almost identifying with him. He saw him as a kind of bachelor, embodying Kafka's own sense of solitary existence, those perpetually frustrated strivings, the relentless effort to achieve something, maybe artistic or bureaucratic, only to have it collapse just before completion.
Ah, the solitary figure endlessly striving against an impossible, maybe meaningless, often bureaucratic challenge. That sounds perfectly Kafkaesque. A perfect metaphor for his world.
It really is. But the undisputed modern champion of Sisyphus, the thinker who truly redefined the myth for the modern world, has to be Albert Camus.
Right. His 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. This is kind of the core philosophical moment of our deep dive, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Camus used Sisyphus as the central figure, the ultimate archetype, for his philosophy of the absurd.
Okay, can you unpack that a bit? What exactly is the absurd, according to Camus? It's not just things being chaotic or meaningless.
No, not exactly. For Camus, the absurd isn't inherent in the universe itself, nor is it inherent just in humanity. Rather, the absurd is the conflict. It's the clash, the confrontation that arises between humanity's deep-seated, inherent need for meaning, for clarity, for purpose, and the universe's cold, silent indifference to those demands.
The universe just doesn't answer when we ask why.
Precisely. And Sisyphus, endlessly rolling that rock, perfectly encapsulates this gap, this tension. His intelligence, the very quality he was punished for, forces him to recognize the utter futility of his task. Every time he watches that stone roll back down the hill, he knows it's pointless.
So that moment when he walks back down the slope empty-handed to retrieve the rock again.
Yeah.
That's the key moment for Camus.
Exactly. Camus calls this his hour of consciousness. In that moment, walking down, Sisyphus is actually superior to his fate. Why? Because he is fully aware of its meaningless nature. He sees the absurdity clearly.
He's not ignorant of his condition.
He's lucid. And it is during this downhill descent, this moment of conscious reflection, that Camus argues Sisyphus triumphs over the gods. Not because he breaks the chains or escapes the punishment, but because he chooses how he experiences that punishment. He chooses his attitude towards it.
And this recognition, this lucidity, leads to Camus's really radical, provocative conclusion.
One must imagine Sisyphus happy.
Happy? How can someone be happy in that situation? Pushing a rock forever.
The happiness for Camus comes not from pleasure or success, but from the act of rebellion. The rebellion against the absurd fate imposed upon him by the gods. By recognizing the futility, by acknowledging the absurdity, and then choosing to embrace his task anyway, to pick up the rock again, Sisyphus defines his own world. He owns the rock, he owns the hill, he makes the struggle his own.
So the meaning isn't in reaching the top, it's in the perpetual effort itself.
That's the core of it. Camus concludes famously, "The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." He transforms the punishment, the ultimate symbol of futility, into a source of personal defiance, self-defined freedom, and even a kind of grim joy.
It's a breathtaking inversion. Punishment becomes the source of existential fulfillment. It's incredibly powerful as a philosophy. However, this philosophical optimism seems to be directly challenged by, well, modern psychological study.
It certainly is. And not everyone buys the Camus interpretation, even philosophically. Richard Clyde Taylor, for instance, he used the myth much more straightforwardly to represent a life made meaningless precisely because of bare repetition, the complete opposite of Camus's liberating view.
And this dichotomy, this tension between meaning found in struggle versus meaninglessness crushing the spirit, it's actually tested today in labs.
It is, yeah. Through social science experiments that study what researchers often call the Sisyphusian condition.
Okay, detail that for us. What is the Sisyphusian condition in a laboratory setting? What do these experiments look like?
Well, generally, they are experiments designed to quantify how much motivation a person loses when the perceived meaning of their work is deliberately and systematically stripped away.
How do they do that?
For example, in some well-known experiments conducted by the behavioral economist Dan O'Reilly and his colleagues, participants were asked to build complex objects, like Lego Bionicle models. They got paid per model.
Okay.
In the meaningful condition, as each model was completed, the researchers carefully placed it on a shelf, acknowledging the work, letting the collection grow. In the Sisyphusian condition, however, as soon as a participant finished building a model, the researchers immediately dismantled it, right there in front of them, putting the pieces back in the box for the next round.
Oh, wow. So they were literally rolling the boulder up the hill, only to have it destroyed immediately, making the next effort feel utterly pointless.
Exactly, making the output of their effort visibly useless. And what were the key findings regarding motivation?
What did they find?
The findings were pretty stark. People in the Sisyphusian condition, the ones whose creations were immediately dismantled, they required significantly higher monetary compensation per model to keep working compared to those in the meaningful condition whose work was preserved. They basically stopped working much sooner unless the pay kept going up.
So meaninglessness had a direct, measurable cost in motivation.
Absolutely. Furthermore, the psychological data across various studies generally shows that people work demonstrably harder, longer, and often better when their work seems more meaningful, even if the external rewards, like pay, remain exactly the same.
What's the key takeaway from that research, then?
I think the key takeaway is that people often drastically underestimate the deep intrinsic relationship between feeling a sense of meaning or purpose in what they're doing and their ability to sustain motivation and effort. Objectively useless labor, the kind the gods intended for Sisyphus, seems to profoundly kill motivation in most real humans.
Okay, so that really pits the psychological findings directly against the Camusian philosophy, doesn't it?
It really does.
The objective reality tested in the lab suggests meaninglessness is crushing, while Camus argues that a subjective interpretation, a conscious choice, can make that same meaninglessness liberating.
It presents this inherent tension. Is finding happiness in apparent futility a genuine choice of consciousness, a philosophical triumph? Or is it perhaps more like psychological self-deception, a coping mechanism that just keeps us moving when faced with the unbearable? It's a tough question.
Definitely something to wrestle with. And finally, before we wrap up, let's just briefly touch on that really esoteric theory you mentioned earlier about the name Sisyphus potentially relating to something utterly internal, something physical.
Ah, yes, the theory from J. Negro Sansonese is quite unconventional. He proposed that the name Sisyphus might actually be onomatopoetic.
Meaning it imitates a sound.
Exactly. He suggested it relates to the repetitive Sisyphus, Sisyphus sound of breath moving through the nasal passages during deep, rhythmic, strenuous effort, like the sound someone might make pushing a heavy object or even during certain meditative practices.
Okay, so how does he connect that to the myth?
Sansonese connects the relentless up-down motion of the boulder, that endless repetition, to the fundamental inhalation-exhalation cycle of breathing. He links it potentially to archaic, trance-inducing techniques or forms of breath control used in ancient mysticism or shamanism.
So the eternal struggle with the rock could actually be a coded description of a deeply spiritual or meditative breathing exercise that would completely recast Sisyphus.
It would. It recasts him not just as a trickster king, a punished hubristic figure, or even a philosophical archetype, but potentially as a kind of mystic, someone achieving a state of altered consciousness, maybe even enlightenment, through relentless mechanical repetition.
Turning the ordeal not into punishment or rebellion, but into a kind of ritual path. A way to control the self, maybe, if not the cosmos.
It's a fascinating, if fringe, interpretation. It just adds another layer to this incredibly rich and enduring myth, showing how many ways we can read his struggle. So, as we close out this deep dive, it really is remarkable just to recap Sisyphus's journey through myth and interpretation. We began with that simple definition, right? A Sisyphean task, the pointless rolling of a rock imposed by divine wrath.
Just a synonym for futility. And we end with this figure of pure Metis, of cunning intelligence, who successfully manipulated sacred ritual law, who betrayed the king of the gods for, essentially, city water infrastructure.
Who literally trapped death itself, maybe even Hades.
And who now represents everything from the sun's daily cycle to the vanity of political ambition to the profound modern human need for meaningful work. It's an incredible arc.
He was condemned specifically for his hubris, yes, but also for his brilliant specific cunning. Yet in the modern era, his situation is often viewed as the ultimate crucible, the ultimate test for human resilience and for our ability to construct personal meaning, even in the face of apparent meaninglessness.
The ultimate irony, though, still seems to lie in the original intention of the gods. As you said, they designed his punishment to create an eternity of useless effort, purposefully designed to destroy his hope, break his spirit through futility.
Right. Yet those findings from the Sisyphusian condition experiments, they strongly suggest that objectively useless effort fundamentally destroys motivation, unless some form of meaning is imposed internally by the individual.
Which leads us directly to our final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to consider. If Sisyphus, really following Camus's mandate, truly believed his effort was meaningful, if he subjectively defined his purpose as simply being the man who rolls the rock, embracing that identity, and found a kind of defiant happiness in that sheer repetitive struggle, did the god's punishment actually fail?
And taking it a step further, what does this seeming necessity of self-definition, of imposing our own meaning in the face of cosmic indifference or even hostility, reveal about the true nature of human freedom, regardless of the particular boulder, real or metaphorical, that we find ourselves forced to push each day?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are talking about a system of such incredible complexity and power that, honestly, it's almost impossible to truly grasp. I mean, every moment of every day, your body's immune system is executing this perfectly orchestrated war, fighting off viruses, bacteria, potential tumor cells, all with a precision that, well, no machine could ever replicate.
It really is a marvel of evolution, absolutely. Right. But if you stop and think about that immense, constantly running power, this vast army of immune cells designed specifically to identify and destroy anything foreign, the central paradox becomes pretty glaring.
Right.
If the system is so potent, how does it manage, most of the time, to avoid turning that power inward? How does it stop itself from destroying the very tissues and organs it's supposed to protect?
Yeah, that question, the mystery of immune self-tolerance, that's really what defines the fundamental biological breakthrough we're covering today. We are unpacking the 2025 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, awarded to Mary E. Brunkow, Fred Ramsdell, and Shimon Sakaguchi for identifying the body's ultimate, let's call them security guards.
Mm-hmm. Their combined work provided the essential knowledge that solved the puzzle of peripheral immune tolerance. And we're talking about the second absolutely critical layer of defense here. This is the one that guarantees that even when the immune system is fully activated, fully armed, it tolerates the body's own tissues. And this wasn't just, fixing a minor scientific oversight. It fundamentally defined a whole new field. It paved the way for targeted treatments in cancer, autoimmunity, transplantation, treatments that were just impossible before.
So before we can really appreciate the scale of their breakthrough, we need to set the scene a bit. You have to understand the immense difficulty, the sheer sort of mathematical challenge the immune system faces, and, well, what the scientific community thought was the solution way back in the 1980s.
Yeah, the context is key.
All right, so our story of self-tolerance, it really revolves entirely around one type of cell, the T cell, or lymphocyte. These are the specialized sentries, you could say. They're born in the bone marrow, they mature in the thymus, and they're absolutely central to adaptive immunity.
Exactly, and T cells come in different specialized flavors, each with a critical role. For our story today, we primarily care about two types, the helper T cells and the killer T cells. Helper T cells are kind of like the generals. They coordinate the whole attack, they recognize threats, they signal other cells to mobilize.
Right.
Killer T cells, they're the sharpshooters. Their job is to identify and basically eradicate cells that have been infected by viruses or pathogens, or cells that have gone rogue, like tumor cells.
And how do they do this incredibly sophisticated surveillance? They use these specialized proteins on their surface called T cell receptors. Think of them like millions of tiny specific antennae constantly sampling little bits of protein presented on the surface of every cell they bump into.
And the way the body creates these receptors is, well, it's the marvel, but it's also the central problem we were talking about. T-cell receptors aren't pre-programmed with specific targets. They're created through this process called VDJ recombination. You can almost picture it like a biological slot machine, where various gene segments, variable diversity, and joining segments are randomly shuffled and combined as each T-cell develops.
And the sheer number of possible combinations is just staggering.
It really is. The theoretical number is mind-bogglingly vast. It could exceed 10 to the power of 15. That's a 1 with 15 zeros after it. 10, 15 zeros after it. 10, 15 unique receptors. This huge library is basically the body's guarantee that no matter what threat pops up, a new flu strain, some exotic pathogen we've never seen, even a completely novel virus like the one that caused COVID-19 back in 2019, there's always likely to be a T cell somewhere that can recognize it and kick off a response. This randomness is the secret sauce for immune flexibility.
But that flexibility comes at a cost, doesn't it? That massive random generation process. It means the body must also, just by pure chance, generate T cells whose receptors perfectly match and recognize the proteins found naturally on our own healthy tissues, our endogenous proteins.
Exactly. It's an unavoidable side effect of having such a comprehensive defense system.
That's the inevitable flaw, as you said.
It is. If you generate 10, 15 potential keys, it's almost certain some of them are going to fit your own locks. And this is why the accepted mechanism for preventing immediate self-destruction, going way back to the 1980s, was something called central tolerance.
Right. Describe that old theory for us. The idea was basically that these potential rogue T cells, the ones that could attack our own body, were caught early, before they ever got out into the bloodstream.
Precisely. The T cells mature in the thymus, that's a gland located in your chest, behind the breastbone. While they're developing there, they undergo this really rigorous screening process, like a boot camp. First, they get checked to make sure their receptors actually work, that they can bind to things properly. That's called positive selection. Then comes the crucial part, negative selection. Any developing T cell that shows strong recognition, a strong binding affinity for the body's own proteins, the self-proteins presented to them in the thymus, is eliminated.
Oh.
They're triggered to undergo apoptosis, which is basically programmed cell death. They commit cellular suicide.
So the military boot camp theory, weed out the potential traitors, the self-reactive cell, while they're still in basic training in the thymus. That's it. Simple.
That was the widely accepted dogma, yes.
Yeah.
And historically, this view was actually heavily reinforced by some earlier scientific dead ends. Back in the 1970s, some researchers had sort of played with the idea of a second layer of control, maybe a dedicated cell type that actively suppressed the immune response. They called them suppressor T cells.
Ah, I've heard of those. But the evidence for those initial suppressor T cells was messy, wasn't it?
It was very messy, often inconsistent, difficult to reproduce, and sometimes based on experimental methods that turned out to be flawed. So when the concept of central tolerance came along, offering this neat, simple, elegant answer, just eliminate the rogue cells, The more complex, frankly confusing idea of active suppression got completely thrown out. Discredited, really.
Yeah.
The consensus became, if a T cell attacks self-tissue out in the body, it must represent a failure of central tolerance in the thymus, period. There was no backup system thought to exist.
So the prevailing mood in the scientific community, say, in the early 1990s, was that immune self-tolerance was this all-or-nothing process, executed entirely in the thymus, done and dusted. But this clean, elegant theory missed one fundamental kind of stubborn piece of evidence, something that suggested the story wasn't quite over.
Exactly. And that stubborn piece of evidence really captivated our first laureate, Shimon Sakaguchi, who was working in Japan at the Aichi Cancer Center in Nagoya. Unlike most of his peers at the time, Sakaguchi just couldn't let go of the idea that there had to be some kind of active regulation happening out in the body, a mechanism beyond just deleting cells in the thymus. He was really swimming against a very strong scientific current back then.
And his main clue, his primary evidence, came from this kind of paradoxical mouse experiment performed by his own colleagues, right? This is a great example of science progressing not from proving a hypothesis, but from trying to explain a result that just didn't fit.
Precisely. Sakaguchi's colleagues were studying the thymus and its role in immunity. They were performing surgical removals, thymectomies, on newborn mice.
Yeah.
Their straightforward hypothesis was, okay, if we remove the T cell factory, the thymus, these mice should have fewer, weaker T cells and therefore a compromised immune system. Pretty logical.
Makes sense.
But what they observed was this really weird timing anomaly.
Okay, tell us about the timing difference.
Well, if they removed the thymus right after birth, say day 1, the mice often survived, although yes, they were immunocompromised as expected. But if they waited just a couple of days and did the procedure 3 days after birth, the results were absolutely catastrophic. These day 3 thymectomized mice developed these raging systemic autoimmune diseases. Severe inflammation of the gut, their thyroid glands were attacked, their spleen and lymph nodes became massively enlarged and sickly. Their immune system wasn't weak, it was dangerously hyper-aggressive against their own bodies.
Wow. So those first 3 days were absolutely critical. Whatever mechanism normally protected the body from this kind of self-attack had apparently already been established and deployed into the circulation within those first 72 hours. Removing the thymus after that point meant you lost the factory, sure, but the cells that were already out there, they just went completely rogue without whatever was regulating them.
That was exactly Sakaguchi's immediate conclusion. It couldn't just be about deleting T cells back in the thymus. There had to be a specific population of cells released from the thymus during those crucial first 3 days that actively regulated, actively controlled the rest of the immune system out in the periphery. These were the missing security guards.
So he set out to prove their existence with his isolation experiment. This sounds crucial.
Yes, it was definitive. To prove this active regulation existed, Sakaguchi performed a really elegant experiment. He took T cells from genetically identical, healthy adult mice, normal mice. He then carefully separated this mixed population of T cells, and he injected them into those mice that had their thymus removed 3 days after birth, the mice that were otherwise guaranteed to develop that raging autoimmunity.
Okay, so he's transferring T cells from a healthy mouse into one that's destined for autoimmune disaster. What happened?
It protected them. The injection prevented the disease. The mice that should have succumbed to severe self-attacking illness were largely protected by the total population of T cells he transferred. And critically, he did control experiments. If he transferred only the potentially attacking T cells, which he could isolate based on certain markers, the mice still got sick. But when he transferred the full mixed population from the healthy mouse, the disease was blocked.
So that proved it.
It proved, fundamentally, that within that mixed population, there was one type of cell actively restraining, actively suppressing the other potentially dangerous cells.
That is a phenomenal conceptual leap right there. It showed that immune regulation wasn't just passive elimination back at headquarters. It was active control out on the streets, so to speak.
It absolutely did. But now came the really hard part, a challenge that took him about a decade. Identifying the specific molecular signature of this restraining cell. How do you pick it out of the crowd? Researchers already knew that these cells were T cells, and they carried the surface marker CD4, which was confusing because CD4 is the marker usually found on helper T cells, the ones that are supposed to activate the immune system.
Right, so you had cells that looked like the commanders, CD4 positive, but they were actually acting like peacekeepers or suppressors. They were kind of the wolves in sheep's clothing, biologically speaking.
Exactly. That was the paradox. So Sakaguchi spent the next 10 years meticulously trying to find the unique molecular tag, some other protein on the surface, that differentiated these regulatory CD4 cells from the much larger population of conventional CD4 helper T cells. It was incredibly painstaking work, separating cell populations using various antibodies and assays, and then testing their function. Did they suppress or did they activate?
And he finally nailed it in 1995, found the key differentiator.
Yeah. Yes, in a landmark paper published that year, he showed that these calming suppressive T cells carried not only CD4 but also consistently expressed high levels of a second protein marker, CD25. This subtle yet consistent difference being CD4 positive and CD25 positive allowed him to finally isolate, purify, and characterize this new class of cell. He formally named them regulatory T cells, or TREGs for short.
Okay, so by 1995, we have the physiological proof from the mouse experiments, and we have the cellular marker, CD25, for Sakaguchi's security guard cell. But you mentioned skepticism remained high, partly because the field had been burned before with those old suppressor T-cell ideas.
Yeah.
But what were the critics still demanding?
They needed the why. Okay, these CD4 plus CD25 plus cells suppress things, but how? What was the underlying molecular mechanism? What made them act differently? Crucially, what was their master control switch inside the cell? That was the missing piece.
And the answer to that molecular question, the why, would come from a completely different line of research, starting with a historical quirk involving mice in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a place connected way back to the Manhattan Project, oddly enough.
That's right. This part of the story begins with a specific, naturally occurring mutant mouse strain known as the scurfy mouse. For years, labs had noticed that male mice born with this particular genetic trait were intensely sickly. They exhibited chronic, widespread inflammation. They had scaly skin, which is where the name scurfy came from. And very characteristically, they had massively enlarged organs. Their spleen and lymph nodes were just engorged with runaway immune cells. They typically didn't live long, only a few weeks.
And this fatal illness was clearly a classic case of the immune system rebelling against the mouse's own body, a total breakdown of self-tolerance.
Absolutely. It was a violent, systemic autoimmune attack. And crucially, genetic studies had already shown that this mutation was X-linked. That means the faulty gene was located on the X chromosome. This explained why it primarily affected male mice, who only have one X chromosome. If they inherit that faulty one, they get the disease. Females with two X chromosomes usually have a backup healthy copy.
And that X linkage was a huge clue, wasn't it? It strongly suggested that maybe a single gene, when mutated, was responsible for this catastrophic failure of immune regulation.
Exactly. It pointed towards a potential master switch.
Okay, now let's bring in our other laureates, Mary Brunkow and Fred Ramsdell. They were working together at a biotech company called Celtech Chiroscience up in Bothell, Washington. Their focus was on developing new treatments for autoimmune diseases, and they instantly recognized the unique power of this scurfy mouse model.
They saw it immediately. They realized that the key to understanding potentially all autoimmune diseases might be hidden within this single faulty gene in the scurfy mouse. If they could just find that one mutation, identify that gene, they could potentially uncover the master molecular switch controlling peripheral immune tolerance in general. It was a huge gamble, but the potential payoff was immense. So they decided to dedicate themselves to finding the specific gene responsible for the scurfy condition.
We really have to emphasize the timeline here again. This was the mid to late 1990s. This was not the era of cheap, rapid, whole genome sequencing like we have today, finding one specific mutation back then.
Oh, it was a monumental task, like finding a single typo in a massive unindexed encyclopedia set. The mouse X chromosome contains about 170 million base pairs, 170 million letters of genetic code. The computational power, the sequencing technology, it just wasn't there yet for a quick search. Brinkow and Ramsdell first had to use these complex, incredibly laborious genetic linkage analysis techniques, basically using known genetic landmarks to narrow down the region on the X chromosome where the mutation had to be.
How far did they manage to narrow down that search area? From 170 million bases to what?
They managed, after a lot of work, to narrow it down to a region containing approximately 500,000 nucleotides. 500,000 bases. Still massive by today's standards, but, a manageable target for the time.
Still sounds pretty daunting.
It was. Their work then became this really grueling exercise in detailed molecular mapping. They had to physically order and map out the segments of DNA within that 500,000 base pair region, and then for every potential gene they identified within that segment, they had to sequence it meticulously in both healthy mice and the sick scurfy mice, looking for that one critical difference, that one mutation.
It sounds like a true scientific marathon, just fueled by sheer determination and probably a lot of late nights in the lab. They must have been comparing dozens of potential candidate genes within that region.
They identified 20 potential genes within that narrowed down segment, 20 needles in a haystack, even if it was a smaller haystack now. Each one required detailed, dedicated sequencing and comparison work. You can just imagine the tension as they systematically went through the list, checking gene number 1, comparing sequences, nothing. Gene 2, normal. Gene 3, fine, all the way through.
But the faulty gene, it turned out to be the very last one they checked, didn't it? Talk about persistence paying off.
Unbelievably, yes. It was only the 20th and final candidate gene on their list that finally gave them their definitive breakthrough. Bingo. They found a specific single base pair mutation, a tiny change in the genetic code, in a gene that, at the time, was previously unknown. They did notice, however, that this new gene had structural similarities to a known family of genes called the FOX genes, which stands for fork-head box. These FOX genes were known to act as transcription factors.
Transcription factors, those are the genes that control the activity of other genes, right? Like master switches.
Exactly. They bind to DNA and regulate whether other genes get turned on or off. So finding a mutation in a FOX-like gene made perfect sense in the context of such profound immune system failure. They named their newly discovered gene FOXP3.
Wow. A completely unknown transcription factor revealed as the direct cause of catastrophic immune failure in these mice. That's a fundamental discovery in itself. But their work didn't stop there. They immediately suspected and then confirmed the human connection.
Yes, the symptoms of the scurfy nose, the severe autoimmunity, the X-linked inheritance were almost a perfect mirror image of a rare but devastating human autoimmune condition called IPEX syndrome. IPEX stands for immune dysregulation, polyendocrinopathy, and neuropathy, X-linked syndrome. It's a mouthful, but it describes boys born with similarly catastrophic multi-organ immune attacks. They often suffered from severe diabetes, thyroid problems, gut inflammation, and tragically often die in infancy or early childhood without treatment like bone marrow transplant.
So Brunkow and Ramsdell must have raced to check if the human version of this new FOXP3 gene was also mutated in boys suffering from IPEX.
They did exactly that. Working rapidly with pediatric immunologists and clinicians, they managed to collect DNA samples from several unrelated boys who had been diagnosed with IPEX syndrome. They sequenced the human equivalent of the gene, which they called FOXP3, all caps for the human gene, in these patients, and they confirmed it. Harmful functional loss mutations in the human FOXP3 gene were indeed the direct cause of IPEX syndrome.
Incredible. So their findings, published back-to-back in Nature Genetics in 2001, provided the critical molecular mechanism. They proved that this single specific gene, FOXP3, was the absolute linchpin responsible for preventing the severe, fatal breakdown in immune self-tolerance in both mice and humans. We now had Sakaguchi's regulatory cell, the TREG, and Brunkow and Ramsdell's master gene, FOXP3. The pieces were falling into place.
And the final crucial synthesis of all this work happened very quickly after that, around 2003. Several research groups, importantly including Sakaguchi's own lab, conclusively demonstrated the definitive link. They proved that the FOXP3 gene, the molecular switch discovered by Brunkow and Ramsdell, is the absolute master regulator that dictates the development, the function, and even the stability of those regulatory T cells that Sakaguchi had identified 8 years earlier.
Okay, so let's break that down. If a developing T cell, say in the thymus or perhaps even later, starts expressing high levels of the FOXP3 protein inside its nucleus,
it gets programmed to become a regulatory T cell. Its fate is sealed. If it doesn't express significant FOXP3, it proceeds down other pathways, maybe becoming a helper T cell or a killer T cell.
So FOXP3 acts like the foreman on a construction site, telling that cell what job to do.
That's a good analogy. FOXP3, being a transcription factor, sits in the cell nucleus and binds to DNA. It essentially turns on a whole specific genetic program, activating dozens of other genes while shutting down others. By initiating this unique program, FOXP3 fundamentally shifts the cell's identity. It changes it from a potential attacker into a dedicated peacekeeper. It programs the cell to become a master suppressor of immune responses.
And establishing this direct link FOXP3 controls TREGs. This is what fundamentally defined peripheral immune tolerance, didn't it?
Right.
It showed it wasn't just some vague phenomenon, but a clearly defined active biological process, driven by a specific gene executed by a specific cell type.
Exactly. It showed that central tolerance, the deletion in the thymus, while definitely important, was only the first line of defense. It wasn't the whole story.
Peripheral tolerance, mediated by FOXP3 and TREGs, is the essential backup system, the ultimate insurance policy, really.
It absolutely is. And this system, driven by TREGs, has a vital dual function. The first function is the one we've mostly been talking about. These TREGs act as the security force constantly patrolling the circulation in tissues. Their job is to ensure that any potentially self-reactive T cells, those that inevitably slip past the screening process in the thymus, are actively restrained and prevented from launching an attack against the body's own tissues.
The existence of those slippage T cells is really important, isn't it? It implies that the central tolerance system in the thymus is inherently leaky, or maybe can't possibly screen against every self-protein perfectly.
That seems to be the case. The sheer diversity needed in the T-cell receptor repertoire to fight off any potential external threat makes it practically impossible to achieve perfect elimination of all self-reactivity during development. There's always going to be some low-level potential for autoimmunity. Therefore, the body absolutely relies on these active security guards, the FOXP3-driven TREGs out in the periphery, to manage that constant low-level threat and maintain peace.
Okay, that's function one, preventing accidental self-attack.
Huh.
What's the second key role of these regulatory T cells?
The second function is perhaps just as crucial, especially for long-term health after you've fought off an infection. It's the shutdown mechanism. Think about it. When you have a major infection, say a bad flu virus, your immune system ramps up dramatically. T cells multiply rapidly, they become highly activated, they operate at peak intensity. This causes significant inflammation. That's the fever, the aches, the swelling you feel. It's necessary collateral damage to fight the invader.
Right.
But once the pathogen is successfully eliminated, the body needs an immediate and effective way to stand down that hyper-aggressive immune response. You can't just leave the system running at full throttle indefinitely. Regulatory T cells play a critical role here. They step in to calm things down, ensuring the immune system doesn't continue working at top speed, which would otherwise lead to chronic inflammatory damage or even trigger autoimmunity in the aftermath of the infection.
That detail really changes how you think about the immune system's design, doesn't it? It's not just about detection and destruction. It's equally about control, moderation, and resolution. And Laureate's work proved that this control isn't just a passive winding down. It's an active, genetically coded process driven by FOXP3 and TREGs. This discovery just immediately transformed immunology. It shifted the focus from simply maximizing the attack to figuring out how to achieve the perfect balance.
And that transformation, that new understanding of balance, immediately opened up countless avenues for medical applications. It was like finding the immune system's dimmer switch. For the first time, researchers had a specific molecular lever, this FOXP3 TREG axis, that they could potentially manipulate to tune the immune system up or down as needed. And we are now seeing treatments based on this knowledge advancing rapidly through clinical trials, generally following two opposing strategies depending on the disease you're trying to treat.
Okay, let's start with cancer. Here, the goal is usually the opposite of tolerance. You want the immune system to attack. So the strategy involves decreasing the action of these regulatory T cells, right? Undermining the security guards.
Exactly. Tumors, being the devious biological entities they are, have actually figured out how to exploit the body's own self-regulatory mechanisms to protect themselves. A lot of research has now definitively shown that many solid tumors, think melanoma, breast cancer, colon cancer, many others, are often heavily infiltrated by or surrounded by a high concentration of regulatory T cells. These TREGs are actively recruited to the tumor environment by specific chemical signals the tumor releases.
So the tumor essentially hijacks the body's own peacekeeping force, co-ops the security system to build a protective shield around itself.
That's precisely what happens. Those regulatory T cells, operating under the command of FOXP3 within the tumor microenvironment, actively suppress the local immune response. They release suppressive signaling molecules, cytokines like interleukin-10 and TGF-beta, which effectively paralyze the killer T cells that are trying to infiltrate the tumor and destroy the cancer cells. This creates what immunologists call an immune cold or immunosuppressive microenvironment, basically shielding the cancer from the immune system's attack.
So the therapeutic strategy here is to find ways to specifically neutralize or remove or maybe inhibit the function of those particular TREGs within the tumor area, ideally without crippling the body's overall immune tolerance elsewhere, which would cause autoimmunity. That sounds tricky.
That is absolutely the challenge. Current research is exploring several angles. One approach involves targeted depletion using antibodies, for example, that specifically bind to markers on TREGs, maybe coupled with toxins to try and eliminate them only near the tumor. Another, perhaps more sophisticated strategy involves finding drugs that specifically block the function of TREGs, maybe interfering with FOXP3 activity itself or the suppressive molecules they release. And often the idea is to integrate TREG inhibition into existing immunotherapy regimens. For instance, combining immune checkpoint blockade therapies, which aim to release the brakes on killer T cells, with drugs that simultaneously target TREG signaling pathways. The goal is a coordinated punch. Unleash the attackers while also dismantling the tumor's protective TREG shield.
Okay, that makes sense for cancer. Turn down the suppressors. Now let's pivot to the completely opposite strategy. Treating autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus. Here, the problem is too much attack against self, so you want to boost the security guards, the TREGs, to restore tolerance.
Exactly. In these autoimmune conditions, the body's killer T cells, and sometimes helper T cells too, are mistakenly targeting healthy tissues, pancreatic beta cells in diabetes, the myelin sheath around nerves in MS, joint tissues in arthritis. The regulatory T cell system is either insufficient or malfunctioning. So the therapeutic concept is straightforward. Stop the friendly fire by reinforcing the peacekeeping force. Find ways to increase the number or enhance the function of the patient's own regulatory T cells.
And how are researchers trying to achieve that boost in TREGs?
One of the most promising avenues currently in clinical trials involves using a naturally occurring signaling protein called interleukin-2, or IL-2. Now, IL-2 has been known for a long time, and at high doses, it actually stimulates the proliferation of all T cells, including the attacking ones, which can be dangerous. But what scientists discovered, somewhat serendipitously, is that TREGs express a high-affinity receptor for IL-2. This means that very low, carefully controlled doses of IL-2 preferentially stimulate and expand the population of regulatory T cells much more effectively than they boost the effector T cells.
So low-dose IL-2 acts almost like a specific fertilizer for TREGs.
Yeah.
It helps them thrive and multiply, effectively increasing the size and strength of a security force without overstimulating the attackers.
Precisely. It tips the balance back towards suppression and tolerance. Pilot studies using low-dose IL-2 therapy are ongoing for various autoimmune conditions, and they've shown that it can safely increase TREG populations in patients and, in some cases, lead to clinical improvement. It offers a potentially elegant way to restore the broken immune balance naturally, rather than just hitting the whole system with broad immunosuppressants.
And this leads us directly into the third major area of application, transplantation. The challenge here is very similar to autoimmunity. You need to prevent the immune system from attacking something it sees as foreign, in this case, the transplanted organ.
Right. Transplant rejection is fundamentally a powerful immune attack against the donor organ. The recipient's T cells recognize the proteins on the transplanted liver or kidney or heart as non-self and mobilize to destroy it. Traditionally, this has been managed with powerful, broad immunosuppressive drugs, things like cyclosporine or tacrolimus. These drugs work, but they essentially mute the entire immune system. They hit it with a sledgehammer. This leaves the transplant recipient highly vulnerable to opportunistic infections and even increases their long-term risk of developing certain cancers because the immune surveillance function is dampened everywhere.
But the knowledge gained from Brunkow, Ramsdell, and Sakaguchi suggests a much more targeted pathway, right? A way towards achieving specific tolerance just for the new organ, moving away from that dangerous blanket immunosuppression.
Absolutely. This is where the field gets really exciting, entering the realm of advanced cellular engineering, building directly on the TREG discovery. Researchers are now actively practicing sophisticated forms of cellular therapy. The basic idea is you isolate a patient's own regulatory T cells from their blood. You then expand them exponentially in the laboratory, grow them into the billions, creating this massive army of supercharged peacekeepers. And then you infuse these expanded autologous, meaning the patient's own, TREGs back into the patient, often around the time of the transplant surgery. The hope is that this flood of TREGs will induce tolerance specifically to the new organ.
And the most cutting-edge research takes that concept even one giant step further, doesn't it? Integrating insights from cancer immunotherapy like CAR-T cells, but flipping the script. We're talking about creating engineered TREGs, sometimes called CAR-TREGs.
Yes, exactly. It's a brilliant adaptation. You take the concept used in CAR T cell therapy for cancer, where you engineer killer T cells with a chimeric antigen receptor, or DARR, to make them specifically target a protein on tumor cells. But here, you engineer regulatory T cells with a CAR designed to recognize a specific target on the transplanted organ.
So instead of creating a CAR T cell that's a guided missile to kill cancer, you're creating a CAR Treg that's like a guided shield, specifically programmed to protect the new organ.
That's the idea. The CAR acts as a highly specific address label or homing device. It's engineered to recognize a protein that is present on the donor organ, but not widely elsewhere in the recipient's body, maybe an allantogen, one of those proteins that differs between donor and recipient. When these engineered CAR tregs are infused back into the patient, they should theoretically travel directly to the transplanted kidney or liver, bind to it via their CRR, and concentrate their suppressive activity right there, at the site of potential attack.
That is just an astonishing level of potential precision. You're sending a dedicated security detail right to the specific organ that needs protection, instructing them to keep the peace locally while leaving the rest of the immune system fully functional to fight off actual threats like viruses and bacteria. This feels like moving from the equivalent of chemotherapy for the immune system broad suppression to something more like laser-targeted radiation therapy, hitting only the necessary spot.
It really is the potential fulfillment of the promise inherent in discovering peripheral tolerance. Sakaguchi showed the crucial cell existed. Brunko and Ramsdell found its master switch, FOXP3. And now medical science is figuring out how to build the control panel, how to manipulate that switch and direct those cells with unprecedented accuracy. This discovery didn't just reveal a fascinating piece of biology, it gave us the fundamental blueprint for potentially reprogramming the human immune response for therapeutic benefit. Hashtag tag tag outro.
What a truly profound journey we've taken today. From a puzzling observation in newborn mice all those years ago to now designing custom-made cellular security forces with specific delivery addresses. This Nobel Prize really rightfully recognizes three distinct yet perfectly complementary contributions that together launched an entirely new era in medicine and immunology.
Absolutely. We honor Shimon Sakaguchi for that crucial initial physiological insight, for persevering against the grain, and for the meticulous work isolating the specific regulatory T cell marked by CD4 and CD25, proving way back in 1995 that active immune suppression was a biological reality.
And then we recognize Mary Brunko and Fred Ramsdell for that incredibly grueling, decade-defining molecular detective work, solving the mystery of the scurfy mouse and, through that, identifying the absolutely crucial master control gene for tolerance, FOXP3, publishing that link in 2001.
And it was the convergence of their work, really cemented around 2003, that established FOXP3 as the definitive molecular blueprint for regulatory T cells and thus for peripheral immune tolerance. It confirmed the existence and the mechanism of this essential backup security system, the one vital for our survival. Their fundamental knowledge truly has, and will continue to, confer the greatest benefit to humankind, as the Nobel Committee states, by providing the essential map for these targeted immune therapies that are now actively fighting cancer, autoimmunity, and completely revolutionizing the field of transplantation.
And as we wrap up, reflecting on the stunning precision of these emerging cellular therapies, especially those CR tregs engineered with specific address labels, it really sets up an incredible question for you, the listener, to consider. If we are now gaining the ability to customize the body's natural security guards, to send them with almost surgical precision only where they are needed, maybe to protect a new organ, or perhaps to contain a specific autoimmune attack in one tissue, what does that mean for the future of those old-school, broad, systemic immunosuppressive drugs?
It feels like we are genuinely entering an era where biological engineering, using the body's own finely tuned mechanisms, is poised to replace cruder chemical suppression. The fundamental challenge and the incredible opportunity for the next generation of researchers is built entirely on the foundation laid by Brunko, Ramsdell, and Sakaguchi. Can we achieve immune tolerance that is so complete, so specific, and so precisely targeted that the significant collateral damage caused by blanket immune suppression becomes just a painful memory of medicine's past? That's the ultimate goal.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping back quite a way, back to 1848, a single year that really just turned the map and the politics of Europe completely upside down.
Yeah, it's often called the springtime of nations, or sometimes the springtime of peoples. A bit romantic, maybe.
Definitely sounds it. But it describes what was, well, arguably the most intense, widespread revolutionary wave Europe had ever seen up to that point.
Oh, the scale is just, it's staggering when you look at it. We're talking about uprisings and changes affecting over 50 different countries and territories.
50, wow.
Yeah. And it sort of started, well, not exactly quietly, but maybe less dramatically in Sicily, January 1848. But then, boom, within just a few months, it exploded. Paris, Prague, Vienna, Venice, all the way east, even into places like Wallachia.
Okay, so clearly not just a local Sicilian issue then.
Yeah.
What was the common thread? I mean, with that kind of spread, the specific problems must have varied a lot, right?
They did, absolutely. Local grievances were everywhere. But the core demands, surprisingly, had this remarkable consistency across the continent.
And those were,
Fundamentally, they were democratic and liberal demands. People wanted to dismantle the old entrenched monarchical systems. And in many places, think Germany, Italy, the Habsburg lands, there was this huge push to create independent, unified nation states.
fueled by that romantic nationalism idea that was really taking hold.
Exactly. That was a powerful force in the 1840s, this idea of the nation, the people.
Still, it feels like a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
To get that kind of continent-wide
Yeah.
combustion, you need more than just nationalism and some liberal ideas, surely.
Okay, let's unpack this. What was the potent mix? What actually lit the fuse for all this?
Yeah, good question. You really have to look at the underlying pressures that had been building for decades. Many historians talk about this sort of hangover from the dual revolution.
I do a revolution.
Yeah, the combined shockwaves from, one, the political ideas unleashed by the French Revolution, and two, the massive social and economic upheaval caused by the Industrial Revolution. Together, they created this deep, simmering, well, a crisis in the development of the new society, as some put it. All right, that makes sense. Politics and economics colliding. So
Yeah.
rapid, disruptive change always creates friction.
Always. And it created a perfect storm, really. You had demands for political rights meeting, just sheer economic desperation.
Let's start with the economic side then. The sources, well, they paint a pretty brutal picture, especially of city life.
Well, urban life was getting rapidly worse for huge numbers of people. Industrialization was picking up speed, right? And this led to fierce competition. You had the rising middle class, the bourgeoisie, kind of jostling with this rapidly growing industrial working class.
And conditions for those workers were bad.
Horrific. I mean, truly horrific. Unskilled laborers working 12, sometimes 15 hours a day, living crammed into these squalid, disease-ridden slums. We see life expectancy actually plummeting in some of these new urban districts.
And it wasn't just the factory workers, was it? The sources point out that the traditional artisans, the skilled craftspeople, they were also getting squeezed.
Absolutely crushed in many cases. They'd relied on the old guild systems, you know. But now mechanization was just decimating their livelihoods.
Like the example of the German tailors.
Exactly. Highly skilled work, carefully honed craft, suddenly undercut by cheap, mass-produced clothes pouring out of new factories, particularly in Prussia. They just couldn't compete on price or speed.
So their whole way of life, their social standing, was just eroding.
Precisely. And that erosion fueled a lot of the radical sentiment, especially in the German states. These weren't just unskilled laborers. These were formerly respected members of society pushed to the brink.
Okay, so you had this long-term structural decline, this grinding misery, and then came a shock, right? The economic panic of 1847.
Yes, that was the immediate trigger for widespread economic collapse. It hit hard and fast, mass layoffs, bankruptcies everywhere.
Any specific numbers?
Yeah, the sources give some stark examples, like 10,000 factory workers in Vienna lost their jobs almost overnight. In Hamburg, 128 firms went bust. It was a sharp, sudden downturn.
And you can see a link between the countries hit by this panic and the ones that revolted.
Almost a perfect correlation. The industrial shockwave seems to map directly onto the revolutionary map, with one interesting exception, the Netherlands. They got hit economically too, but managed to avoid major political upheaval, something to maybe circle back to.
Okay, so that covers the cities. But Europe was still overwhelmingly rural then. How did the countryside figure into this instability? Was it linked to the urban movements?
Often disconnected, actually. Rural discontent had its own dynamics, but it was just as explosive. A major factor was the massive food crisis.
The potato failure.
The European potato failure, exactly. 1845, 1846. We often focus on the Great Famine in Ireland, understandably, but it was a continental disaster.
Right, it hit everywhere.
Pretty much all of northern Europe suffered famine or near-famine conditions, and the numbers are just, well, terrifying. Rye harvests in the Rhineland, a key grain area, dropped to like 20% of normal levels. The potato harvest in the Czech lands was cut in half.
Which means food prices.
Went through the roof. Wheat prices more than doubled in places like France and Habsburg, Italy, and that led directly to hundreds of local food riots. People were starving.
And on top of the hunger, you still had these old, oppressive feudal structures lingering, didn't you?
Yeah.
Especially in Eastern and Central Europe.
Yes, absolutely. That's crucial. Feudalism wasn't entirely gone. Peasants were still struggling with not enough land, and they still owed obligations to landowners.
Like the robot.
Exactly, the robot in the Habsburg lands. Basically, mandatory unpaid labor. Imagine facing starvation and still being forced to work for free for your lord.
Desperate situation.
Totally desperate. And it led to things like a huge increase in wood theft from common lands, just people trying to survive. Conviction rates for that soared in places like the Palatinate. So the peasants were hungry, often in debt, and increasingly criminalized just for trying to stay alive.
So this dual crisis, industrial misery in the cities, feudal pressure and famine in the country, that's the fuel. Now the ideas, how did these radical concepts provide the spark, the blueprint for change?
They provided the ideological engine, the language for revolt. And you have to remember, these ideas, democracy, liberalism, socialism, they sounded really radical in the 1840s, subversive.
So what did democracy mean to them then? Not just voting, presumably.
No, it meant universal manhood suffrage, getting rid of the old systems where only property owners could vote. A massive change.
And liberalism.
Liberalism primarily meant the consent of the governed, so constitutional rule, parliaments, and crucially, individual freedoms.
Okay.
Freedom of the press was a huge one, freedom of assembly, freedom from arbitrary arrest.
Okay, and socialism, that term must have been quite new, quite fluid.
Very fluid. It didn't have one single definition, not like today. But in the 1840s context, it consistently meant demanding more power for working people, better economic conditions, and often some form of worker control or ownership over production. It was fundamentally about economic rights alongside political ones.
And these ideas spread quickly.
Incredibly quickly, thanks to cheaper printing, rising literacy rates, newspapers, pamphlets. They gave the widespread discontent a voice, a framework.
All right, so you have the fuel, you have the spark. Which brings us to the actual explosion. You mentioned the speed was astonishing.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Yes. The revolution seemed to unfold in these 4 incredibly distinct, fast-paced seasons, starting with spring 1848.
Which was surprisingly successful.
Astonishingly successful. The old regimes were just completely flat-footed. Leaders were forced to grant liberal constitutions almost overnight. Italy, German states, Austria.
Even Metternich, the arch-conservative, fled Vienna.
Yep, fled in disguise. And the biggest shock, perhaps? The French monarchy was overthrown again, and the Second Republic was declared. For a few months there, it really looked like the entire old order was just crumbling, a true springtime.
But those early alliances,
Yeah.
workers, middle class, liberals, radicals,
Yeah.
they were always going to be fragile, weren't they?
Extremely fragile. And they fractured very quickly. That brings us to summer 1848, division and strife.
Why did that coalition fall apart so fast and so violently?
Fundamentally, class interest and property. The middle-class liberals, they wanted their political rights, the Constitution, the Parliament, the vote for themselves, but they were deeply wary, often terrified, of the workers' demands for economic change.
Socialism.
Exactly. They feared socialism meant chaos, the end of private property. And the minute the workers pushed for more radical economic reforms, the middle class balked.
And the French example here is just brutal. The June Days uprising.
And it really is the starkest example. The provisional government in Paris had set up these national workshops, sort of state-funded work programs to guarantee jobs for the unemployed.
A concession to the workers.
A major concession. But the more conservative middle-class elements in the government saw them as, well, dangerously radical, inefficient, expensive, and basically socialism in action. So in June, they abruptly shut them down.
And the workers responded.
With barricades in the streets. It turned into incredibly bloody street fighting in Paris. But this time, the middle class, now organized in the National Guard and backed by the regular army, crushed the workers' uprising. Thousands killed, thousands more arrested or deported.
A turning
A
point.
decisive one. It showed the middle class chose order and property over continuing the revolution with their working class allies. That unity was shattered. And elsewhere, like in Germany, reformers just got bogged down in endless debates in their new assemblies, achieving very little concrete progress.
They lost momentum,
Yeah.
which leads, I suppose inevitably, to autumn 1848 and into 1849, the reaction.
Yes. The pendulum swung back hard. The aristocracy, the monarchs, the military leaders, the forces of reaction, they had been stunned initially, but they weren't defeated. They saw the divisions in the revolutionary ranks and exploited them brilliantly.
Yeah.
They regrouped their loyal armies and launched coordinated counter-revolutions across Europe, and they were ruthless. We're talking tens of thousands killed in the fighting and the repression that followed, even more forced into exile or thrown into prison.
So by late 1849,
By October 1849, pretty much every single revolutionary regime established in the spring had been overthrown. The old rulers were back, often ruling with even more authoritarian power than before. The springtime was well and truly over.
let's look at some specific examples to see how this played out differently. France, as always, seems like a whirlwind.
France is the classic case of revolutionary instability, isn't it? February Revolution, Second Republic declared, full of hope. By June, civil war in the streets, and that chaos paved the way for it.
Louis Napoleon Bonaparte,
Yeah.
Napoleon's nephew.
The very same. He played on the name recognition, presented himself as a figure of order, gets himself elected president in late 1848, then, less than 3 years later, pulls off a coup d'etat in December 1851, dissolves the republic, and declares himself Emperor Napoleon III.
So France went from monarchy to republic back to an empire in less than 4 years. Incredible.
It showed just how much the French bourgeoisie, and much of the peasantry too, feared instability and radicalism more than they desired liberty by that point. They chose authoritarian stability.
Alexis de Tocqueville nailed it, didn't he? That quote about society being cut in two.
Yes, it's perfect. Society was cut in two. Those who had nothing united in common envy, and those who had anything united in common terror. That really captures the class division that doomed the Republic. The propertied classes were so terrified of the envy of the poor, of potential communism, that they threw their lot in with a dictator to protect themselves.
Okay, so that's the rapid implosion in France. Contrast that with the Habsburg Empire, particularly Hungary. That was a much longer, bloodier struggle.
Oh, the Hungarian Revolution was the longest lasting and, in many ways, the most formidable challenge to the old order. The Hungarian patriots, led by figures like Lajos Kossuth, were incredibly organized and passionate.
They had clear demands, the 12 points.
Yes, the 12 points laid it all out. An independent Hungarian government responsible to a parliament, a national guard, abolition of censorship, union with Transylvania, equality before the law. It was a comprehensive program for a modern nation-state.
And they actually achieved independence for a while.
They did. They fought off the initial Austrian attempts to crush them and declared full independence in April 1849. They had a functioning government, a motivated national army. It was a serious state-building project.
But the reaction, when it came, was overwhelming.
Utterly overwhelming. The Austrians alone couldn't defeat the Hungarians. So the young Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph called for help from his fellow autocrat, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia.
Gendarme of Europe.
Exactly. Nicholas was terrified of revolution anywhere, especially nationalist revolution on his borders. He obliged by sending a massive Russian army, sources say over 300,000 troops crashing into Hungary from the east.
300,000 against that kind of force.
Resistance was futile. Caught between the Austrians and this enormous Russian force, the Hungarian army was forced to surrender in August 1849. The repression afterward was brutal executions, imprisonment, years of martial law. It was a stark message. The old empires would use overwhelming force, including foreign intervention, to crush nationalism.
A very different outcome from France's internal collapse. Now, at the other extreme, you mentioned Denmark as an exception. Peaceful transition.
Relatively peaceful, yes. It's a fascinating contrast. Denmark also has strong liberal and nationalist movements demanding change, but crucially, the monarch handled it differently.
King Frederick VII.
Yes, he'd just come to the throne in January 1848, right as things were heating up. Faced with large demonstrations demanding a constitution, instead of calling out the troops, he essentially gave in.
Just like that.
Pretty much. He dismissed his conservative ministers, appointed reformers, and agreed to end absolute monarchy. By 1849, Denmark had a liberal constitution and a bicameral parliament, the Riksdag. It moved from absolutism to constitutional monarchy without a major violent revolution.
And there's that great anecdote about him.
Ah, yes. The story goes that after signing away his absolute power, his first words were supposedly, "That was nice, now I can sleep in the mornings."
Whether it's true or not, it kind of captures the difference, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
It highlights that where the ruling elite was willing to compromise and concede power, a peaceful or at least less bloody transition was possible. But in most of Europe, that wasn't the case. The immediate result was defeat, humiliation, and renewed repression.
Which brings us back to that common view, 1848, a failure. A turning point where history failed to turn, as one historian famously put it. You mentioned the anarchist Proudhon's quote.
Yes, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, writing right afterwards, was utterly demoralized. "We have been beaten and humiliated, scattered, imprisoned, disarmed, and gagged. The fate of European democracy has slipped from our hands. You can feel the despair."
And the facts on the ground seem to back him up, right? The repression was real.
Oh, very real. As we noted, the Austrian Empire became a police state.
Yeah.
State surveillance, censorship, arrests skyrocketed from maybe 70,000 in 1850 to reportedly 1 million by 1854. Political activity just went underground or ceased altogether across much of Europe.
This led to the wave of emigration, the 48ers.
Exactly. Thousands of disillusioned revolutionaries, liberals, radicals who saw no future in Europe, around 4,000 or so are estimated to have fled, mainly to the United States. People like Carl Schurz, who became a prominent U.S. politician in general, they carried those ideals elsewhere.
So immediate picture, failure, repression, exile. But is that the whole story? You mentioned historian Priscilla Robertson arguing for a longer-term view.
Right. If you step back and look beyond 1849 or 1850, the picture becomes more nuanced. Robertson and others argue that while the revolutions failed in their immediate aims of establishing stable liberal republics, many of their core goals were actually achieved within a couple of decades.
Achieved by their enemies.
Often, yes. The conservative regimes that crushed the revolutions realized they couldn't just turn back the clock entirely. They were forced to modernize, to adopt some of the revolutionaries' demands to ensure their own survival and stability.
Okay, like what? What were the lasting changes that couldn't be undone?
The biggest, most fundamental one was the final death blow to feudalism in Central Europe. The peasant obligations, the robot, serfdom where it lingered, that was gone. Abolished permanently in Austria and Prussia by 1850. Even Russia finally abolished serfdom in 1861, partly spurred by the lessons of 1848.
So the legal foundation of the old aristocratic land-based power was dismantled.
Exactly. That was a profound, irreversible social change. Even if peasants didn't immediately become prosperous landowners, their legal status changed forever.
And politically. Any lasting gains?
Well, France, despite becoming an empire again, kept universal male suffrage. That precedent was hard for other countries to ignore in the long run, and the sheer pressure of 1848 forced regimes like the Habsburg monarchy to seriously reform their administration.
Which led eventually to the Ausgleich.
Precisely. The Compromise of 1867 that created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. It was a way for the Habsburgs to manage the powerful Hungarian nationalism that had nearly destroyed them in 1848. And ironically, who helped negotiate it? Former Hungarian revolutionaries like Gyula and Dressy.
So the old guard had to adapt, had to incorporate some of the forces they'd fought against.
They had to. 1848 proved the old ways were simply unsustainable. The aristocracy couldn't just run things like their personal fiefdoms anymore. They now had to contend, however reluctantly, with nationalism, with demands for constitutionalism, with a more mobilized public sphere.
So 1848, not an immediate victory for liberal democracy, but a catalyst. It forced change, even if it wasn't the change the revolutionaries initially wanted. Okay, before we wrap up, there's one more darker aspect to the legacy you mentioned earlier, anti-Semitism.
Yes, it's a really important and disturbing part of the story. Several historians, notably Reinhard Rupp in the German context, argue that 1848 was a key moment in the development of modern political anti-Semitism.
How so?
Well, in that atmosphere of intense social upheaval, economic anxiety, political chaos, the collapse of the old order, the feel of the new industrial economy, existing prejudices against Jews, fused with these new anxieties in dangerous ways.
Conspiracy theories emerged.
Exactly. Conspiracy theories that painted Jews in this contradictory, impossible position simultaneously as the symbols of exploitative international finance and as subversive agents of social revolution. They were blamed for both capitalism and socialism, depending on who was doing the blaming.
That's a classic scapegoating mechanism. Blame a visible minority for complex problems you don't understand or can't control.
Precisely. We even have reports from places like Vienna at the time, amidst all the turmoil and economic hardship, explicitly stating things like, tyranny comes from money and the money belongs to the Jews.
Wow. Pinning the blame for systemic problems directly onto an entire group.
It shows how readily deep-seated prejudice can be mobilized during times of crisis. It was easier for some, including elements of the old and even new elites, to deflect blame onto Jews rather than confront the failures of the existing economic and political systems. It's a pattern we've seen repeated, tragically.
Okay, so summing up, 1848, the springtime of nations. It starts with this incredible continent-wide explosion of hope for liberal national states. It largely fails in the short term, crushed by conservative reaction, but it leaves behind crucial long-term changes.
Absolutely. It fatally wounded feudalism, forced monarchies to modernize and eventually concede constitutional limits, and cemented nationalism as a dominant political force they couldn't ignore. The old aristocratic order was proven fundamentally fragile.
It was a failure that, in a way, ultimately succeeded in changing the game, even if the players who won weren't the ones who started the revolution.
A harsh education for Europe, you could say. It revealed not only potential for democratic change, but also the deep divisions within society and the dangerous ways political and economic fear can manifest.
Which brings us to that final provocative thought. You highlighted that quote from Vienna, linking tyranny, money, and the Jews.
Yes. It raises a really relevant question, I think. In a period of rapid, almost overwhelming change in information, think of the impact of cheap print then, maybe analogous to the internet now. How quickly can widespread social and economic anxieties merge with existing prejudices? How easily are scapegoats created and weaponized politically when people feel like the world is spinning out of control?
It's a dynamic from the 1840s, but it feels incredibly contemporary. Something for you, the listener, to definitely mull over.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complex, contradictory, and ultimately transformative year of 1848.